mangrove-lined shoreline of southwest Florida had always been our go-to spot for fishing. Greg and I had been heading there for years, the routine familiar and almost comforting. The warm waters and peaceful atmosphere provided the perfect setting for dropping our lines. Atmosphere aside, it was a great place to reel in a good-sized tarpon or snook. We arrived just as the last sliver of sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The marina was quieter than usual, but that didn't bother us. We were used to the stillness, even preferred it. It wasn't the most glamorous place, far from it, really, but it was affordable and, for our purposes, almost quaint. Most of the boats docked there looked like they hadn't moved in decades, their paint chipped and hulls covered in barnacles. The few operational ones that tied up there fit in nicely with the backdrop of industrial warehouses and rusty, forgotten cranes that lined the waterfront. Greg parked the truck while I hopped out to start unloading the gear. A light breeze brushed against my face, carrying with it the salty tang of the sea mixed with the faint scent of oil from the nearby mechanics' shops. It was the kind of smell that reminded you of years of fishing trips, sunburned afternoons, and cold beers on the water. "You good back there?" Greg called as he swung around to the back of the truck. "Yeah, just grabbing the cooler," I said, lifting it out of the bed and setting it on the dock. The marina wasn't much to look at, especially at night. A few of the overhead lights flickered sporadically, casting long, distorted shadows across the old wooden planks. The water lapped gently against the boats, but it looked black in the dim light, almost like ink. Our boat, an old but reliable fiberglass runabout, was tied off at the end of the dock. We'd taken it out so many times that we could have prepped it in our sleep. "Look at that fog rolling in," Greg muttered, setting the tackle box on the floor of the boat. I glanced over my shoulder. Sure enough, a thin veil of mist was creeping in from the shoreline, swirling around the empty boats and slipping between the posts of the dock like it was alive. It wasn't unusual for a fog to set in this time of night, but somehow it made the marina feel even more isolated. We slowly pulled away from the dock, the engine purring softly as we cut through the water. The ride out to our fishing spot was always a highlight for me. It was a quick 10-minute trip down the inlet before we reached open water. The further we moved from the marina, the quieter it became. The fog swirled lazily around us as we passed through the channel. Greg kept the boat at a steady pace as we hit the mouth of the inlet. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, barely lighting the surface of the water. We anchored near a familiar spot, close to an old dredging barge that had been abandoned years ago. The place wasn't marked on any map, but we discovered it by accident one summer when the fishing had been slow. Fish liked to congregate around the hull as it offered a place to hide, as well as a buffet station for all types of algae. The barge itself loomed over the water like a relic, its metal sides covered in rust and barnacles, with half-submerged machinery jutting out like the bones of a long-dead creature. There was practically no sound aside from the water lapping against the hull and the chirp of various seabirds. Greg cast his line first, the whir of the reel breaking the silence. I followed, dropping in from the bow. The water was calm, and there was a chill in the air that hadn't been there earlier. I zipped up my jacket and settled into my seat, watching the tip of my rod for any signs of movement. For a while it was peaceful. The occasional ripple broke the stillness as fish stirred below, but the night was otherwise quiet. There was no wind, no sound from the nearby shore, just the gentle creak of the boat rocking in place. "You hear that?" Greg asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I stopped, listening. "Hear what?" He frowned, scanning the water. "Thought I heard something, like a splash." Greg shrugged, but he seemed uneasy. I cast another glance at the barge, its dark silhouette looming over us. Something was unsettling about it tonight. Usually, it was just a rusty old structure. But now, in the mist, it seemed almost alive, like it was watching us. "Maybe it's this damn fog messing with us," Greg muttered, his voice tight. He reeled in his line and cast again, more out of habit than focus. I could tell he was distracted. A few moments later, there was an unmistakable splash, which made us both sit up straight. This wasn't the kind of sound fish made. It was bigger, heavier. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it over the side of the boat, but there was nothing. Just dark water lapping quietly against the hull. We were about 100 feet from the shoreline and the endless thicket of mangroves, but there wasn't any movement over there either. Okay, that's weird, I admitted. You think it's something in the water? Greg didn't answer right away. He was staring off toward the barge. I don't know, but I can't say I like it. I followed his gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw something. Just a brief shimmer in the mist near the barge. A figure, maybe, standing on the deck. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just a trick of the fog. I blinked again, staring hard at the barge, but there was nothing there. The fog continued to swirl lazily around its rusted frame, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My rational mind told me it was just a trick of the light, the mist playing games with my eyes, but something deeper, something primal, was telling me we weren't alone. Maybe we should head back, I said, trying to sound casual. Without a word, he started reeling in his line. I did the same, glancing nervously at the water around us. Another splash sounded, closer this time, like something large was moving just beneath the surface. It was slow, deliberate, like whatever was out there wasn't in a rush. I couldn't see anything through the fog, but I felt it, a presence, almost like the water itself was watching us. The boat rocked gently, and the quiet creak of the hull seemed deafening in the stillness. Greg moved quickly, securing the rods and preparing to start the engine. I grabbed the flashlight again, sweeping the beam across the water. There was still nothing, but my gut was screaming at me to get out of there. As Greg turned the key, the engine sputtered, then died. Come on, he muttered, trying again. The engine coughed once, then went silent. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Is it flooded? I don't know, Greg said, his voice strained. He tried the key again, but the engine didn't respond. I grabbed the oars and started paddling, my hands shaking slightly as I pushed against the thick water. The fog was getting heavier now, wrapping around us like a shroud. Greg cursed under his breath as he fumbled with the engine. I kept paddling, but it felt like we weren't getting anywhere, like the boat was stuck in place. Every splash of the oar felt muffled, absorbed by the oppressive silence. The marina suddenly felt a lot farther away than it should have been. What is wrong with this thing? Greg muttered. A sharp, metallic sound echoed across the water. A scraping, like something being dragged across the deck of the barge. We both froze, our eyes snapping toward the old structure. There, just barely visible through the mist, was movement. Someone, was walking along the deck of the barge, their silhouette blurry and unnatural in the fog. Did you see that? I whispered, my throat dry. Yeah, Greg said, his voice barely audible. I saw it. We watched, transfixed, as the figure moved slowly across the deck, their steps heavy and deliberate. They stopped at the edge, facing us, though we couldn't make out any features. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the water, the fog swirling between us like a barrier. We need to go, I said, my voice breaking the spell. Greg didn't argue. He grabbed the emergency paddle and joined me, and together we started rowing. The engine was dead, but I wasn't going to sit there and wait for it to magically start working. Every stroke felt like a battle. The water thick and resistant, as if something beneath the surface was pushing against us. Behind us, the scraping sound came again, louder this time. I risked a glance back at the barge, and my heart lurched. The figure was gone. Where the hell did they go? Greg muttered, his face pale in the moonlight. I didn't answer. I didn't want to think about it. All I knew was that we had to keep moving. The fog was closing in around us, thicker than before, and the marina's faint lights had disappeared completely. It was like we were trapped in a world of our own. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the oars, the steady splash of water, but my mind kept drifting back to the barge. To the figure. Another sound broke the silence. This time much closer. A splash, like something breaking the surface right beside the boat. Greg and I both stopped rowing, holding our breath. What the hell was that? Greg shouted, his voice barely controlled. I don't know, I said, frantically looking over the side, but there was nothing, just dark water stretching out into the fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A log, maybe? Or something drifting beneath the surface? Manatees frequented these waters. Maybe it was that? But deep down, I knew it wasn't something as innocent as debris or a manatee. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the water went still. The fog seemed to lift slightly, and I could just make out the faint outline of the marina in the distance. The lights were like tiny beacons, calling us back to safety. "Keep paddling," I urged Greg, my voice tight. "We're almost there." He didn't need to be told twice. We rowed in silence, the adrenaline pushing us harder than before. The fog began to thin as we neared the marina, and the oppressive weight that had clung to the air finally started to lift. By the time we reached the dock, my arms were shaking from the effort. We tied off the boat without a word, our movements hurried and tense. The marina was still empty, and the silence that had once felt peaceful now seemed eerie. We loaded the truck in record time, throwing the gear into the back without the usual care. Greg slammed the tailgate shut, and we both climbed into the cab, breathless and tense. The engine roared to life, and as we pulled out of the parking lot, I finally allowed myself to look back. The marina was quiet, the boat swaying gently in the water. The fog was receding, and the lights reflected off the water like stars. It almost looked peaceful. But as we turned onto the main road, leaving the marina behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still out there.